Movies Square, mon cher. Movies is magic. Oh!
Hi and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. This time around, it's Hidden Gem Movies, starting with the letters E and F. I'm working my way through the alphabet. Going to get started. By the way, there are some references to two of these movies in the thumbnail for this particular video. I thought I'd throw those in just as a bit of an Easter egg. But let's get started with 1958 and one of the first movies of the French New Wave. And it's Louis Malle's Elevator to the Gallows, starring Maurice Ronet and Jean Moreau. Now, this one has a really great setup as a crime movie. It's rock solid. It ends on a really tragic note. Now, the story's pretty simple. Florence and Julien are lovers, and her husband, Simon, is Julien's boss. Julien is ex-military. He was in the Foreign Legion and fought in the war with Indochina at the time. And they decide they're going to kill Simon. The plan is for Julien to climb through a skylight on a weekend when Simon's working in the office, kill him. Florence is played by the wonderful Jean Moreau, and she's beautiful in this film. And Luna has just turned up to claw my chair and meow behind me. So the plan starts, and Simon is murdered. And as he's leaving the building, Julien realizes that he's left the rope to the skylight, and he has to go back and retrieve it because that's part of their perfect plan to kill this guy. So he goes back in the building, takes the elevator up, goes and retrieves the rope, gets to the elevator, and the elevator starts going down. And then the caretaker turns off the elevator electricity for the weekend. And Julien is trapped in the building with a murder victim that he murdered. Meanwhile, Florence is waiting for him. Outside the building, Julien's sports car is stolen by a couple of kids. And Florence sees the car driving down the street and spends the entire night trying to find him, thinking that he's waiting for her in one of the many cafes that they frequented in Paris. It's a really tense thriller, and it's Jean Moreau at her best. She goes through all of the emotions of this woman trying to find her lover, who has just killed her husband. Meanwhile, of course, Julien has tried to escape from this elevator. Beautifully tense stuff, wonderfully tight scripting, beautifully shot by Louis Malle. It's a wonderful film, and I'd heard about it for a long time. And then I found a copy of it, but it's a South Korean pressing of the movie. You see that from the writing on the back there. But it's a great film. I'm going to try to find a better copy of this, but this copy is a good transfer for a DVD. And it's a wonderful thriller, and it's one that not too many English language crime movie buffs know about. But Elevator to the Gallows, you should definitely check out. It should be on your list. It should be in your collection. I don't know if there are any online copies for people to look at, but this one's pretty good. And if you look around, you may well find a copy of it, either on eBay or Amazon, or just by typing Elevator to the Gallows into Google and then hit shopping and see what's available. But that's the first recommendation for the letter E. High recommendation from me. Next one's a 2002 science fiction dystopian thriller. It stars Christian Bale, Emily Watson, Taye Diggs. It also has Sean Bean in it, and yes, he gets killed. And it's a little movie called Equilibrium, which people remember most for the Kung Fu kata that the Graviton clerics use to defeat their enemies, basically using guns in a Kung Fu kind of way. And we see Christian Bale doing a lot of that. It was directed and written by Kurt Wimmer. And it's a weird film. It's like The Matrix meets 1984, meets Fahrenheit 451, meets Brave New World. It's a future when the authorities have decided that the way to stop all wars is for people not to have emotions, because that always works well. And there's a drug that people inject daily to suppress their emotions. Meanwhile, there are a whole group of people going out to destroy every single work of art, because works of art evoke feelings, and they don't want people to have feelings, even though they've got a drug that stops people from having feelings. Now, I like this movie for a couple of reasons. First one is, it looks good. It's got this beautiful brutalist architecture. It's got zeppelins. It's shot really well. And the action scenes are, for the most part, pretty damn good. One of the big bads is played by Angus McFadden. You also got David Hemmings in there as well. It was shot in Eastern Europe mostly, which is a place that has more than its share of brutalist architecture. It's an okay action film. It's kind of fun. But if you think about it too much, all the little pieces don't quite fit together and it turns into a pile of mush. People like this film for the kung fu stuff with the guns, which is kind of interesting and evokes the gun fetishism of movies like The Matrix and The Matrix sequels. For me, I kind of like it. I rewatched it and it was fun, but I started to think about it and that disintegrated the edges of the fun for me, which is a bit of a pity. And I never liked the fact that the hero gets a pass. The impetus for his awakening is not only the woman played by Emily Watson, but is the fact that he doesn't take emotion-diminishing drugs. And he gets a free pass for that. He gets a free pass for all of the shit he did in the past. Rather than having his own moral compass, it seems like his decision-making is determined by how medicated he is. And I find that a very problematic approach. But a lot of people like that. It's a bit of fun, but don't think about it after you've watched it because it will spoil it for you. I always like people trying something and doing better than you expect them to. A bunch of young people just starting out in the industry trying to get somewhere. And the main guy who did this won an Academy Award eventually. It's from 1970. It's a low-budget movie that started out as a student film by Dennis Muren. He took it to a bunch of different people to see whether he could get a release for it. And one producer, Jack Harris, said, yeah, we'll release it, but you need more footage. And so they got a guy called Jack Woods to expand on the story. It's got a lot of special effects, practical special effects, stop motion animation, rear projection, a whole bunch of different things done over a 2.5-year period. And it's a little film called Equinox, which ended up getting a Criterion release, and I think justifiably so. It's an interesting little movie. If you have a look at the back, you can see some of the stop motion animation there of a flying demon. 4 people go out on a picnic, 2 couples, and they find a cave, which is of course Bronson Cave. And an old man in that cave gives them a book and tells them, there's your book now, you've got to have it, ha ha ha. It's a Necronomicon, basically. They find out that one of their professors from back in the day had used it, and the magic in the book has a kind of scientific basis. You know, you mix 2 ingredients together and you get this. It's almost like chemistry, but with magic. And he had tested out the magic by starting some incantations, bringing 2 things together, and things didn't go well for him. And one of the cool things about this is the professor who did this is played by Fritz Lieber, the science fiction writer who wrote any number of great science fiction and fantasy books, including the Fafnir and the Grey Mouse series. So it's good to see him doing some acting. His father was a character actor in 1940s and 1930s Hollywood, Fritz Lieber Sr., but he did this almost as a help to these film students who were making this film. It's got some really great things. There's a park ranger who is also a demon called Asmodeus, who kind of plays it a little bit like Sterling Hayden. And even though the actors for the 4 protagonists aren't the best actors in the world, they're people helping out, there's some production values here way beyond what we expect. The cave scenes, for instance, were on a set in Dennis Muren's backyard. And the old guy who hands the book was actually Dennis Muren's grandfather. And Dennis Muren went on to win Academy Awards for special effects for the Star Wars movies. This one from Umbrella Entertainment, I like. I've got this one from ages ago. And it's all region, which is kind of nice. If you can find this one, you can play it anywhere. It's in full frame 4:3 because that's how they filmed it. But I like what they did with this one. And the special effects do draw attention to themselves because they're fairly crude. And the stop motion stuff is quite clearly stop motion. They do a scene with a giant, which is done with forced perspective. That works really well. Again, these guys are using every technique in the book to try to get across the story they're trying to tell. And Equinox is a valuable movie for that reason. It's a lot of fun to watch. There are a lot of scenes of people running around the forest and along creek beds and things like that to fill out the time. I think it's still a worthy piece of work. So there's a fully packed out DVD copy of this movie, and it's one that if you haven't seen it, you should. And if you haven't seen it for a while, you should see it again. There's probably a version or 2 of this floating around on YouTube, but I always like to support the creators where I can, so I got this physical copy of it. Next Victim is in the public domain. I know that because I bought it 15 years ago. You can go into the $2 shops here in Australia, which were kind of thrift stores. They weren't exactly thrift stores, though. We can buy cheap things there, like Dollar Tree in the UK. And they would always have a rack full of public domain movies. You know, you could get Plan 9 from Outer Space. You could get a whole bunch of other ones. You could get Night of the Living Dead. And there was this documentary called European Nights, which is actually an Italian documentary dubbed into English. This is the English language version. And it's got a really nice conceit. It's from 1958. And what it basically does is takes you around all the cabarets and nightclubs in Europe. Well, not all of them, but a number of them, in a number of different European countries. And shows you the acts that are there. And there's also some circus acts in there. But this one I found really interesting for a number of reasons. It's got people like Domenico Modugno, the guy who sang Volare, in there. It's got Henri Salvador, the French comedian and singer, doing a cabaret performance at the Lido with really beautiful women. They've got strippers, but they don't take the striptease too far. They've got can-can dancers. They have ventriloquists and jugglers and stage magicians, including Channing Pollock, who a few years later turned up as the lead character in Georges Franju's movie Judex, which is a movie I recommend that you see. It's a lot of fun and a really interesting addition to the other movies that Franju did, including Eyes Without a Face. I was going to put Eyes Without a Face in the E's, but I thought that one was a little obvious, and I've talked about it on the channel before. But European Nights, it's not in the best condition. The transfer isn't terrific, but it's very, very watchable. There is an Italian version of this on YouTube, which you can watch, but the narration's in Italian. And it's got things like 1950s English rock and roll people, like a guy called Colin Hicks and his band, who are basically redoing American rock and roll hits. There's a belly dancer who's really interesting. I like belly dancers. I'll tell you my belly dancer story quickly. I went up to Sydney for my birthday about 15 years ago, and my sister, Linda, whom I love a lot, took me out and got me drunk in Newtown. And we did a bit of a pub crawl, and then we ended up in a Turkish restaurant where there was a beautiful belly dancer in red. So she's dancing around and kind of flirting, really an adept belly dancer and quite attractive. So my sister gets her to sit on my lap, takes a photo of it and sends it to Sally. And I kind of had to explain why my sister was taking a photo of me with a lap full of belly dancer. Good times. But ever since I've had a fondness for belly dancers. But yeah, this one's great because it's got a few interesting and very forward-looking things. For instance, there is the Ukrainian National Choir. Back when Ukraine was under the thumb of the Russians, they had cultural exchanges, and the people are wearing traditional costumes and playing traditional instruments and singing. And so Ukraine had kept its culture as much as it possibly could while it was under the thumb of the Soviet Union. And in this, you get to see the Ukrainian National Choir in their traditional costumes, which is one thing that plays very differently now than it would have in 1958. The other thing is there's a performer, a female singer called Cocinelle, who was a big cabaret star in the late 1950s across Europe. Cocinelle was the first transgender cabaret star. And she looks beautiful. She went and had all the surgery and everything and became a big cause celeb, and in later years became very much an advocate and a vocal advocate for transgender people. And seeing her in this was really interesting and shows that, in spite of what some people will tell you, transgender people have existed for a very long time. In this case, almost 65 years. Well, it is 65 years. When people start telling you that this didn't happen when I was young, they're not telling you the truth, and this is documentary proof of that. But it's a really nice cabaret. You get to see the way nightclubs were, how people dressed, the music and entertainments that people had. I love it for that historical aspect, and I thought that I might bring it to your attention so that you can maybe find it and enjoy it. The last one of the 5 E's is a 1969 American horror film directed by David Loweridge and written by Joseph Stefano, who did the script for Psycho. It stars Gail Honeycutt, Michael Sarrazin and Eleanor Parker, and it's Eye of the Cat. Now, there's a more recent version than this Blu-ray out, but this is the one I've got. I first saw this in the cinema and it was really creepy. It's about a guy called Wiley, played by Michael Sarrazin, who is contacted by the beautician for his Aunt Danny, played by Eleanor Parker, a woman called Cassia Lancaster, played by Gail Honeycutt. She knows that Wiley's going to inherit, and she wants Wiley to help her scare Aunt Danny to death, so that Wiley gets the money, Cassia gets half of it, and everything works well. There are a few twists and turns in that, but one of Wiley's weaknesses is he's an allurophobe. He's scared of cats because of a childhood trauma. and his Aunt Danny has a house full of cats. It's a kind of interesting little thriller. It's got a few suspenseful scenes. It's set in San Francisco, and it looks great. You get to see a bit of Sausalito. You get to see a bit of the top of the hill areas of San Francisco in it. And it's a movie that's kind of forgotten now because it doesn't have any really big stars in it. And people don't particularly remember it, but I remember it. And I like what it does. It was a Universal movie. Universal made some interesting films in the 1960s that weren't their A features, but were really interesting. There were things with George Peppard, for instance, which I'm going to talk about in the future when I get a copy of a George Peppard movie box set that's coming out very soon. But I Had a Cat is an interesting one. I like the cats in it as well. And they're filmed in a beautiful way that makes them very creepy. Like they're watching Wiley all the time and like they're protecting and guarding Aunt Danny. And I find that really fascinating. Things don't go well for the antagonists in this. And I'm not going to say who necessarily the antagonists are. It's a really cool little thriller that a lot of people have forgotten from the 1960s. That's worth revisiting, and it has a very much a groovy 60s vibe about it in some ways. And I always liked Eleanor Parker as an actress. She was really good and was not served particularly well by Hollywood because inevitably people age, and Hollywood wasn't always kind to actresses as they get older. This next one is a magic trick. It's a magic trick of a movie. It's by one of the great magicians and charlatans of the 20th century. It's about forgery. It's about fakery. It's about con men and con women. It's also a con on the audience. And it's a marvelous film called F for Fake with Orson Welles. This is the Criterion edition. It's the English Criterion edition. And F for Fake, I love. It was filmed by Orson Welles and Francois Rockenbacher and Gary Graver. And it tells a few different stories, and it tells them in interesting ways. And Orson Welles was always a wonderful storyteller.
Ladies and gentlemen, by way of introduction, this is a film about trickery and fraud, about lies. Tell it by the fireside or in a marketplace or in a movie. Almost any story is almost certainly some kind of lie.
It's the story of Emile de Hory, who's one of the great art forgers of the 20th century. An interesting character. He was Hungarian-born. He was in a concentration camp during the war. He was persecuted for being gay various times, and he also made a lot of money, both in America and in Europe, by being a fantastic and instinctive art forger. He forged Picasso drawings and Modigliani drawings, Vermeer of Lamech. They could fake anybody, even fakes the autograph of Orson Welles in the movie. And Emile de Hory was living on Ibiza, the island of Ibiza, alongside another one of the great con men of that period of the late 20th century, a guy called Clifford Irving, who with his wife faked an autobiography of Howard Hughes. He got $750,000 as an advance for it, and then it came out that he'd never met Howard Hughes. And so there were all these legal cases and other problems that Clifford Irving had had. And Clifford Irving had already written a biography of Emile de Hory. So everything curves back into itself. And then the last third of the film is a magic trick and a con that Orson Welles perpetrates on the audience using very smart film editing and the assistance of his muse and partner, Oya Kodar, who was beautiful. She's also in Orson Welles' last movie, The Other Side of the Wind, which is still on Netflix, and I hope it gets a physical release at some stage. It's a beautiful piece of work, and it shows that even at the end of his career, Orson Welles was doing things that nobody else could do with cinema. And in this one, he's playing games. He's being playful. It's got people like Paul Stewart, who he worked in the Mercury Theatre with. It's got Joseph Cotton as well, with a little bit of stuff to camera, and Lawrence Harvey. I love this movie because it's playful. It's Orson Welles being playful. It's a playful magic trick. As an expert storyteller, telling a story. In fact, telling a number of different stories and having a great time. He's sitting around enchanting people at a bistro in Paris, where he talks about how art experts don't necessarily know good and bad art, particularly at that stage. These days there are technological ways of checking on art forgeries, but at the time the idea of checking up on art forgeries was very, very rudimentary, and people didn't know what they were talking about most of the time, particularly art dealers. The movie comes with a booklet, which I always like. On the back, everything in this film is based on the available facts. It's strictly based on the available facts. It's a movie to treasure and to love, and Orson Welles had so much trouble getting financing for his movies. These days he wouldn't have. These days somebody with the track record of Orson Welles would have no trouble getting funding for movies, but this is the 20th century and the Hollywood studios held everybody's throats in their hands. But if for fake, you should check out and enjoy and have a copy of for yourself. There's a pirate copy of a movie about piracy and fakery, something that you should get. That's up to you. Adult films are an interesting part of cinema history because it's okay for you to be scared shitless by a movie, but it's not okay for you to be aroused by one. And for a time in the 60s, 70s and 80s, adult movies were a kind of date film for some people. Deep Throat and movies like that were date films. People went to see them with their partners. Movies like Emmanuel, Just Shaken's Emmanuel, did incredibly well. And the sequels, and Histoire d'O, The Story of O. So an Australian movie producer called John D. Lamont decided he was going to get into the Emmanuel game. And in 1979, he did that with a movie starring Gloria Annan, a Canadian actress, Felicity. Now, ignore this one. This is a double Blu-ray from Umbrella of Felicity and an Australian movie called Centre Spread. But Felicity was Australia's Emmanuel. Felicity is a teenager who goes to a remote Catholic school and has a relationship with another girl there. And then when she leaves school, she's sent overseas with some friends of the family who are very beautiful people themselves. They go to Hong Kong. She has various adventures of various kinds in Hong Kong and comes away in love and with a boyfriend who loves her and admires her for what she is after she has all these erotic adventures. It's shot quite well, this film. It has a lot of Hong Kong locations. It has a few Australian locations as well. But it's in that exact same genre, and it learned a lot from Just Shaken's movies, particularly Emmanuel. And it has lots of beautiful young people, male and female, in various states of undress, let's say, and in various compromising positions together. It's got an audio commentary with John D. Lamont, who's unfortunately now died, and the star Gloria Annan. It's got some extended sequences from Not Quite Hollywood, the documentary on Australian exploitation films, with John D. Lamont and Gloria Annan interviewed. And it's got an image gallery and a theatrical trailer. And this one's all region too. I think it's still available on Umbrella's website, so you might want to look up umbrellaent.com.au. In this kind of genre, it's an interesting little film. It's not the best of its type, but it's the only one from Australia. Australia did do a number of sex comedies, but nothing quite like this picaresque, coming-of-age kind of erotic entertainment, apart from Felicity. So I thought I'd throw that one in there for the perverts among you. While we're on the subject of exploitation films, here's one from 1990, an American black comedy horror film, it says on Wikipedia, directed by Frank Henenlotter and written by Bob Martin and Frank Henenlotter. Frankenhooker. I saw this one in the cinema. I kid you not. I think I went to the Valhalla and saw Frankenhooker because I'd already seen Basket Case. I hadn't seen the second and third Basket Case movies, but I'd seen Frank Henenlotter's Basket Case in the original Valhalla Theatre in Melbourne, which was in Richmond. You know how in some cinemas they have those little lights when you're walking down the stairs. There's always a little light on the steps in the cinema so that you can see where you're walking. I remember while I was watching the film, I looked down and saw those lights, and there were cockroaches crawling across my shoes, which really added to the atmosphere of Basket Case. But this one is basically a guy called Jeffrey who is doing Frankensteinian experiments in New Jersey, and he's just accidentally killed the love of his life, and he resurrects her by using the body parts of sex workers because it's 1990 in New York. Times Square is what it is. And Jeffrey doesn't have all of his wheels on the ground. This is a fun movie. It's funny. It's transgressive. It's got a lot It's got some nudity, but it's got a lot of gore effects, some of which are realistic looking, some of which aren't. It's got some interesting supporting characters as well. It has people like, his mum's played by Louise Lasser, who was married to Woody Allen, and also did the old TV series Mary Hartman. She's playing Jeffrey's mum. And you got Shirley Stoller from the Honeymoon Killers playing a person called Spike. So you've got a few familiar faces from earlier decades in this one. There are a ton of extra features on this. This is all region from the UK. Take a look at that. There are a lot of special features there. I like Frank Henlotter's movies. They're always fun. They're always transgressive. They're always gory as hell. Basket Case was breakthrough for me when it came out. I was thinking, where can horror movies go after this? But Frankenhooker, a lot of fun. You should check that out if you haven't already. Down to the last two. This one is a Jean Renoir movie. Jean Renoir went into exile in America in 1940 for obvious reasons because the Germans took over France. It's actually from 1955. It stars Jean Gabon and Françoise Arnault. And it's a movie called French Cancan, which is about the history of the Cancan and about Moulin Rouge. Jean Gabon playing the creator of the Moulin Rouge, a guy called Henri Danglars. It's a beautifully shot film. Of course, it's Jean Renoir, so it's beautifully shot. There are a few movies like this. In 1950, we had John Huston's Moulin Rouge with José Ferrer, but this one's from the French viewpoint and tells the story of the people as they really were, rather than the romanticised Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec that we got from Moulin Rouge. I'm going to ignore the Baz Luhrmann version for obvious reasons. But this one comes with a booklet as well, with a whole bunch of, and with the history of Moulin Rouge and also the history of the making of this film. Because this one's not in English, it doesn't get as much love as, say, Baz Luhrmann's Moulin Rouge, but Jean Renoir's French Cancan is a marvellous looking movie. And this version's got a whole bunch of extras in it as well, which I really appreciate. It's got some stuff on the history of Jean Renoir as a filmmaker. It's got a lot of things about the movie and about the people the movie's based on. And there's a lot of technical work to get this movie restored because it wasn't looked after enough. But eventually it did get restored. This is a Region B version from the UK. But French Cancan is a movie that's got dynamic energy about it. It's got the characters themselves. It's got beautiful costumes from the period, which are just perfect. And it was shot on as many locations as they could use that were still as they were at the early part of the 20th century. But this is a part of entertainment history that I wasn't particularly familiar with, but I like a lot. And if you haven't seen it, French Cancan is definitely a film you should check out. Now, this last one's a Brian De Palma joint, which again I saw at the cinema. Telekinetic Teenagers. It's got Kirk Douglas in it. It's got an exploding John Cassavetes, which not many movies can say. The Fury. It's actually from 1978. And it's in that thing like Carrie and other movies where telekinetic teenagers was wreaking havoc on adults that were trying to manipulate them. In this one, you've got an ex-CIA agent called Peter Sansa, played by Kirk Douglas, whose son Robin is kidnapped and taken to an institute where they are going to weaponize his psychic powers. He's got telekinetic abilities, and the institute, run by Ben Childress, an ex-CIA colleague of his father's, played by John Cassavetes, is basically weaponizing and brutalizing and turning Robin into a sociopath. He gets manipulated sexually by a female agent played by Fiona Lewis, and there are an enormous number of set pieces here. It's a kidnapping set piece, which is all done in slow motion, and Amy Irving plays another psychic who is about to be manipulated by the Institute, but doesn't quite get there. The supporting cast is good as well. You've got Kerry Snodgrass from Diary of a Mad Housewife. You've got Charles Durning and Andrew Stevens plays the son. Some interesting practical special effects work, particularly when the socket goes off and he gets these big veins in his forehead. There are a few bonus features on this one, which is surprising because it's a cinema cult release. There's an interview with the cinematographer Richard H. Klein. Fiona Lewis talking about her work on The Fury. A location journal and theatrical trailer. But this one is kind of over the top. Kirk Douglas gets to do lots of running around, proving he's still a stud. I remember seeing this in the cinema and being blown away by it. It's one of those mad movies from the 1970s where mainstream Hollywood was trying to take on exploitation cinema in the smaller studios and doing large-scale versions of what they were doing as well. So they'd buy up any books that were promising, and then they'd put out these movies. It's got a good soundtrack by John Williams. I may well rewatch this one in the next week or so, because I'm in the mood for some raw exploitation. This is not a movie that you first think of when you think of the career of Brian De Palma. But The Fury is just pure exploitation cinema. Over the top, mad, great special effects. The pitch of it's set at a strident level from the word go. You should check that one out. So there we go. We've covered E, we've covered F now. Next one's a G and H, and there are tons and tons and tons of possibilities for me to talk about when I pick 5 movies from each of those letters. So that's it for this time around. Thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and hit the notification button. You can also support the channel by donating at patreon.com/TerryTalksMovies. I've got some things I was sent from Umbrella Entertainment that I'm going to review in the next video, including an Australian horror movie that was financed by a disco. And I'm looking forward to doing that as well. It's a mad film and you're going to enjoy it. But anyway, until then, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies, watch some really weird films from the past, and I'll catch you next time.